A guy who's never had a girlfriend in his life somehow ends up at a fancy restaurant with the most beautiful woman he's ever seen. And before the night is over, she's going to say something to him that completely changes everything. The question is whether he's ready for what comes next.
A girl leans in close with half-lidded eyes and drops a question that cuts straight to the bone. If not having a girlfriend makes you a loser, does that mean you fall into that category? She says it like it's nothing, like she asks strangers questions this loaded every single day. He stares back at her, glasses fogged, heart already doing things it has no business doing. This is the moment the story starts, and neither of them is walking away from it clean. About a month ago, Yuta was just an ordinary guy with a Twitter account that consisted mostly of complaints and the occasional book review nobody asked for. He had 56 followers, posts about not wanting to go to work, and a tweet about never having had a girlfriend that he posted like it wasn't a cry into the void. Then he posted a review of a book about love, a book he didn't even take seriously, and a notification pinged. Someone named A had replied. She said nice to meet you, that the book was actually pretty good, and that it was her first time connecting with someone who'd also read it. He stared at the message for a long time, heart thumping, trying to figure out what kind of person reaches out to a stranger on the internet over a book review. After exchanging messages for a while, she asked if he wanted to grab dinner sometime. His immediate internal response was, why would she want to meet someone like me? He showed up at the station that evening, with his heart going absolutely haywire, phone clutched to his chest, fully expecting her to take one look at him and disappear. He stood near the clock at the east exit and thought seriously about just going home before she got there. Then someone tapped him on the shoulder and asked if he was Yuta-san. He turned around, and everything he thought he knew about this meeting went out the window. She was beautiful, genuinely, blindingly beautiful in a way he had no framework for, and she was smiling at him like they were already friends. She told him she'd already reserved a table just across the street and gestured for him to follow, completely unbothered. His heart was slamming so hard he could feel it in his ears. He hadn't talked properly to a woman in a long time, and it was becoming very clear that his body remembered that fact. She led him to a restaurant that was far too nice for what he'd imagined this meetup would be, and he stood at the entrance staring at it thinking it was way too fancy. She looked pleased and said she'd been wanting to come back for a long time. He was already struggling to form sentences, and they hadn't even sat down yet. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he was asking himself if this was some kind of setup, if someone was about to jump out from behind a corner. People near the entrance clocked the two of them walking in together and whispered to each other, "They're a couple, right?" No, probably not. He heard it as he walked past and said nothing, face carefully arranged into blankness. The word couple floated in the air between him and the whispers and then dissolved. He told himself that was the correct assessment and tried not to think about why it stung slightly. She clinked glasses with him and toasted to their first offline meetup, beaming at him like none of this was at all unusual. He thought to himself that there was absolutely no way he'd be able to hold a proper conversation with her, so he raised his glass and went for the alcohol. He took a huge gulp of beer, almost immediately choked on it, and started coughing so hard the table shook. She leaned forward and asked if he was all right, and he wanted to dissolve into the floor. She reached across the table and patted his back to help, which only made everything considerably worse, because now she was touching him. He shivered and pulled away and asked why she would do that, which came out way more panicked than he intended. She apologized and said she was just trying to help, that it looked like he'd gotten wet. He told her that being nice to him wasn't going to do her any good, which was, objectively, one of the worst things he'd ever said out loud. He forced himself to apologize properly and admitted he was just a gloomy, difficult person to be around. He also told her that on top of that, he was a loser who had never had a girlfriend, and that love was so far out of reach that he genuinely hadn't taken that book seriously at all. He said he was such a disappointment and laughed at himself, because what else could he do? She looked at him across the table and just said, "Okay," like none of it bothered her even slightly. She set down her glass, leaned forward, and asked plainly, "If not having a girlfriend makes you a loser, do you want her to be your girlfriend?" The words hit him somewhere deep in the chest, and his whole body went still. She was touching his arm and looking right at him, and he had absolutely zero idea how to respond to that. His heart was hammering loud enough that he was genuinely worried she could hear it. She immediately burst out laughing and said she was just kidding, waving her hand like she hadn't just dismantled him completely. He laughed along and said he'd known she was joking the whole time, which was a lie, but he committed to it. She said she was sorry for teasing him, with a grin that communicated zero actual remorse. He sat there with a smile plastered to his face and told his heart to calm down, which it did not do. She looked at him again, more softly this time, and said that even if he was a loser, she still found him cute. The statement arrived without warning, and with no safe place to put it. He stared at her and didn't know what to say, because what do you even say to that? She was smiling and close and completely comfortable with the chaos she was creating, and he was just a man trying to survive dinner. After they finished eating, she thanked him warmly and said the food was very good, and asked cheerfully what else the night had in store. He was still processing the fact that the entire meal had just happened. Given that he'd been in such a panic, he hadn't tasted any of it. He admitted internally that he'd wasted a perfectly good meal at a nice restaurant by being too terrified to enjoy it. She seemed completely satisfied, and that somehow made it better and worse at the same time. Outside, he apologized again for all the embarrassing things she'd had to witness. The choking, the dropped coins, the forgotten wallet, all of it. She stopped him and said with genuine curiosity that she wanted to know what he could do to make it up to her. He thought about it for a second, then looked at her and said the words before he could talk himself out of them. He wanted to walk her to the station. She looked at him for a beat and then said sure. She grabbed his arm as they walked, and he noticed she was swaying slightly, and he asked, voice slightly strangled, if she was drunk. She said perhaps, with a cat-like expression that told him she was enjoying every second of his discomfort. The station was only 1 block away, but she leaned into him as they walked, and he stood there stiff as a board trying to figure out if this was real life. He told himself firmly that this was definitely not real life. He thought about how once they reached the station, they probably wouldn't be meeting again after this, which made him want to slow down. He told himself it'd be nice to take a detour, to spend just a little more time before the night ended. She said nothing and walked alongside him, unbothered by wherever they were going, trusting him to lead. He appreciated that in a way he couldn't quite put into words. They turned a corner, and both of them looked up at the same moment to find hotel signs everywhere. Rest rates, stay rates, information boards lit up in the night. He froze so completely he stopped breathing for a second, and his brain went completely offline. She looked at the signs, and then looked at him with a very specific expression, and asked, very calmly, just where exactly he was planning on taking her. He went into full damage control mode, waving his hands and insisting this was not intentional, that he had not brought her here on purpose, that he had absolutely no idea this street was here. She asked with a smirk if he'd been here before, and he denied it so many times in a row it started to sound suspicious. She just said, heh, and covered her mouth and looked thoroughly entertained by his distress. She offered an out. If he hadn't been here before, then they could just wander a little more. Then she stepped close and grabbed his shirt lightly and looked up at him and said this was his chance to stop being a loser. His heart was going at a completely unreasonable rate. Her hand was on his chest, and he could not tell if she was serious or not. Every rational thought he had was fighting with every irrational one. Was she actually inviting him? No, that had to be impossible. But what if it wasn't impossible? Her eyes were on him, and she asked quietly, almost playfully, if he was going to do it. Terrible things, she clarified, with a tilt of her head. He felt like the universe was testing him on a subject he had never once studied for. Something in him broke through the noise, and without fully thinking about it, he told her, "Please, value yourself more than this." The words came out louder and more earnest than he meant them to, and they just hung there in the air. She went completely still, eyes wide, staring at him in a way she hadn't looked at him all evening. He immediately clapped both hands over his face because he genuinely could not believe what had just come out of his mouth. After a pause that lasted approximately 1,000 years, she smiled, warm and genuine and bright, and said, "Then let's head back, shall we?" She turned as if none of it had happened, and they started walking side by side. And she filled the silence with easy conversation, like flipping a light switch. He still had no idea if he'd passed or failed some kind of test, but she was smiling, and that felt like it might be enough. At the station, they reached the turnstiles, and she pulled out her phone with a smile and said she'd become even more interested in him than before. She took his phone without asking, saved her own contact under a simple letter A, and handed it back with a look that said, "Please feel free to reach out." He stared at the contact she'd just created in his phone and thought the words "my cell phone" like he'd never seen one before. On the train ride home, he sat in his seat staring at the ceiling of the car and thinking that even now, it all still felt like a dream. He kept replaying the moment outside the hotel, the way she'd grabbed his shirt and looked up at him, and he kept wondering what would have happened if he hadn't said what he said. If he had just gone along with it, what would have happened then? His imagination was not helping him sleep. His phone buzzed, and it was a message from her. "Thank you very much for today. It was fun." He stared at the screen, at the little heart she'd attached, at the contact name that just said A, and thought about why he was getting this excited over a single message from someone whose actual name he didn't even know yet. He told himself to calm down. He failed to calm down. He couldn't sleep at all that night. He lay in bed going over and over her words about feeling free to contact her. Did that mean she genuinely wanted to meet again? Or was it just something people say? Reaching out directly felt like too much of an admission, like showing his hand before he understood what game they were playing. The safest option, he decided, was to be indirect about it. His plan: tweet about wanting to see the premiere of a movie and wait to see if she'd reply publicly, because that way it wouldn't feel like he was making a move directly. He spent a full hour writing and deleting drafts, going back and forth on wording, deleting again. He reminded himself that his account was also seen by her and that she'd see whatever he posted. He finally hit tweet and immediately wanted to die. 1 hour later, a notification lit up his screen. She liked the tweet. He rolled onto the floor and lay there face down, trying to figure out whether a like meant she was interested in going together, or whether she was just being polite. She hadn't sent a message or a direct reply, which he read as both everything and nothing simultaneously. He decided to send her a message online and immediately started regretting it. He sent it, and then sat curled against the side of his bed staring at his phone like it had betrayed him. She hadn't read it yet. Hours passed and it was still unread, and he thought she might have blocked him, or found the message annoying, or decided he was too much trouble. He brushed his teeth, told himself to let it go, stared at the ceiling, and had almost convinced himself to delete the message when his phone suddenly vibrated. She called him, an actual phone call, out of nowhere, late at night. He grabbed the phone and answered it, at an embarrassingly high volume with the most chaotic hello he'd ever produced, and she asked him what on earth had him so worked up. Hearing her voice directly in his ear was doing something to his brain that he wasn't prepared for. He told himself to breathe and act normal, and managed neither. She said she was sorry about the movie plans. She already had something going on with someone else that weekend, and hoped they could do it another time. He said, yeah, right, of course, no problem, totally fine, in the cheerful tone of someone quietly imploding. Then she told him to be a good boy and wait for her, said goodnight like it was the most natural sentence in the world, and hung up. He dropped onto his back and stared at the ceiling and thought, "Good night," she said, and his heart completely ignored him for the rest of the night. Back at work the next day, a senior colleague dumped a deadline report on him at the last minute, and his work friend had apparently organized a mixer nobody told him about that was somehow also his fault. His co-worker Takanashi-chan reviewed his work, found errors in the tables, and told him with a sighing expression to fix it right away. She walked off looking thoroughly unimpressed with him, and his friend muttered that she was as unfriendly as always. His work friend then turned to him with a grin and asked what kind of clothes he was planning to wear on his date. He flinched so hard at the word that the whole row probably felt it. He thought to himself, could he even call this a date? They'd never established what they were doing. His friend yelled that Murai was going on a date, and the whole office got involved, and he spent the next 5 minutes trying to explain himself to people who were not listening. He stood in his apartment that evening, pulling through his closet and finding absolutely nothing usable. A skull graphic tee, a faded jacket, clothes that belonged to a person who had given up on being perceived. He decided he needed to do research before buying anything and opened his phone, which immediately buried him under terms like eyeline silhouette and faded casual that meant nothing to him. He stared at the screen for a long time and then put his face down on his desk. He was going shopping that weekend, whether he understood fashion or not. He walked into a shopping mall called Oparu and stood at the entrance of a store looking at the other customers, who all looked like they belonged there, and he did not. He felt shabby standing in the doorway in his plain clothes while couples browsed around him looking effortlessly stylish. He told himself firmly that now was not the time to be intimidated. He walked in anyway. A sales staff member appeared immediately and greeted him with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. He said he was looking for something overall, and the staff member latched onto the shirt already in Yuta's hands and started describing it with the intensity of a man who believed in this shirt with his whole heart. The pitch came fast. New stock, 5 colors, flattering on anyone, pairs with everything. Yuta looked like a cornered animal. Then outside, through the shop window, he caught a glimpse of long blonde hair. His heart lurched sideways, and he told himself he was definitely imagining it. He stepped slightly to the side to look again and felt his pulse spike. No, that was actually her. He stood very still against a rack of clothing and watched, trying to decide what to do, while the sales staff continued pitching things at him. A smooth-looking guy had already approached her outside and was telling her he'd gotten cancelled on, practically inviting himself to tag along. She was ignoring him silently, phone in hand, clearly not interested. Yuta stood frozen watching and thinking he should at least say hello. He opened his mouth to call out from the doorway. Then she saw him first. She walked straight in, lit up completely, and grabbed his arm and told him she'd been looking forward to seeing him. The guy outside started to say something about ditching Yuta and coming with him. but she stepped closer and made it clear without a word that the conversation was over. Yuta stood there with his arm in her grip, absolutely unable to speak, looking at the sales guy who had suddenly realized this man did in fact have a companion. They found a cafe nearby and she settled in across from him, exhaling and laughing about how terrible that had been. She said it was nice they were finally meeting again after a while, and Yuta sat across from her realizing that sitting face to face with her again, she was dazzling, genuinely dazzling. She asked him why he hadn't called out to her right away when he first saw her, and he said he thought it might bother her if a guy like him approached her in public. She tugged at his sleeve and said he gave a different impression from last time. Something had changed. She studied him for a moment and then smiled slowly and asked if he'd been trying to look good for her. His face immediately went red and he said no, that wasn't it. He just thought he should try to look a bit more like a normal human being. She told him his outfit was honestly a bit of a mess. But then she said she found it more charming when someone tried to be fashionable in their own way, as opposed to someone who just approached strangers randomly hoping something would happen. He told himself very firmly not to read anything into that. He gulped his drink and stared at the table and thought, stop, don't get your hopes up. She watched him with that half smile and said, well, your outfit certainly is a bit messy though, and stabbed him right after the compliment. She jumped up and said Yuta-san and pulled him back into the clothing store with her, telling him that since he was slender, she thought he'd look good in something like this, holding a jacket up against his frame. She was very close, and he registered she's so close in the part of his brain that was still online. The sales guy appeared, called him Mr. Boyfriend, and suggested contact lenses for a full image change. Yuta's soul left his body briefly. He tried it on and it actually looked good. Genuinely good, cohesive, like he was a person who had made intentional choices about his appearance. The sales guy said so, she said so. She tugged the lapel and told him it really did look good on him. He stood there in the mirror looking at himself wearing clothes that fit and felt something in his chest shift slightly. The sales guy called him Mr. Boyfriend again, and he decided to just accept that. She paid before he could protest, and he immediately tried to give her the money back, saying these were his own clothes and he'd cover it. She said he didn't need to, and smiled, and said in exchange he should accompany her shopping again sometime. He stood there holding the bag, wearing the new jacket, thinking that the whole afternoon had been something he didn't have a word for yet. They sat outside together afterward, in the warm afternoon light, and he felt more attracted to her with every minute that passed, which was becoming a problem. He thought about the man he'd seen her with earlier, laughing with her, walking close, and thought that if that person was her boyfriend, he needed to know now before he got any further in. He told himself he needed to have her clarify things before he got emotionally invested and ended up hurt. He started trying to bring it up awkwardly, clearing his throat and saying there was something he wanted to ask about. She looked at him with that playful expression and asked why he was asking about a boyfriend. He said, no, that's not... And then she laughed and said, no way, you saw us together? She told him to have called out to her when he saw them. She told him the person was her older brother, and that her brother had been there because he'd had yet another incident where a girl had almost stabbed him, which she described with the casual energy of someone whose family was simply like this. Yuta processed the words older brother with a feeling of relief so enormous it was embarrassing. He immediately arranged his face into an expression of casual neutrality and said, well, that was troublesome. She looked at him with knowing eyes and said, you were jealous, right? He said, no, that wasn't it. It's not like that. She tilted her head and said, after all, we're not like that, are we? With an expression that was entirely unreadable and somehow worse than if she'd just said something clear. He said, ah, haha, and felt like he was walking in fog. She said, come on, it's almost time for the movie, let's go, and grabbed his hand. He walked with her thinking that the man not being her boyfriend meant the day could keep going, and that was already enough. He thought about her saying they weren't like that, and decided for the moment to simply not examine what that meant. She was smiling beside him and excited about the movie and pulling him along, and that was enough for now. He paid for the tickets himself and felt like he'd done at least one thing right. At the ticket machine, he hesitated over the seating chart. Should he pick seats right next to each other? Was that too much? What did people normally do in situations like this? He selected 2 adjacent seats, pressed confirm, and tried to look like a man who had made that decision with complete confidence. She thanked him and said she'd take him up on it, and the smile she gave him when she did was enough to ruin him for the rest of the evening. Inside Theater 2, the seats were side by side, and the lights were going down, and she leaned toward him slightly and said, say, it feels like a date, doesn't it? His glasses fogged slightly, and his heart did something that had no medical name. He sat very still in the dark cinema and thought about the fact that this was the first time he'd ever watched a movie with another person, and tried to figure out what normal people did with their hands in moments like this. The lights went fully dark, and the movie started playing, and he sat there in the cinema telling himself he didn't care whether this was a real date or not. He didn't care about whether it was all right to hold hands. He didn't care about feeling pathetic for not being able to shake off these thoughts. None of that mattered. He curled his hands in his lap and stared at the screen. He absolutely cared about all of it. The movie ended and the credits rolled, and she said she was glad he'd invited her, that it was pretty good. He said he'd thought so too, and then mentioned that she'd actually cried during it, which surprised him. She turned and said she was human too. She cried and got angry sometimes. Was that a problem? He thought internally that it was so cute he could barely stand it, and said nothing, and stared at the wall trying to compose himself. She looked at him and asked narrowly if he thought she was actually angry right now. He panicked immediately and started apologizing, and she broke into a full grin and said she was just teasing him. She wasn't going to get angry over something like that. He realized he had once again walked directly into it. He told himself that someday he would stop falling for this, and then accepted he probably wouldn't. He took a breath and, looking somewhere slightly to the left of her face, said that if she'd like, how about they got a meal together after this? He said it too loudly. He immediately started backtracking, saying it was okay if she didn't have time. He just thought it would be nice to talk more about the movie. She looked at him quietly, considered, and then said she was also getting hungry. In that case, let's go. He exhaled approximately everything in his lungs. She stepped away to fix her makeup, and he finally turned on his phone, which he'd left off for the movie. He started looking up nearby restaurants and found a notification. Some account he didn't recognize had replied to his old tweet about the premiere, asking if he'd already gone and whether they could watch together sometime. He swiped it away without a second thought and kept looking for restaurants. He was busy. She came back looking even more polished than before and said, "Shall we go?" And he said sure, and they walked out into the evening together. He asked if she wanted to take a short stroll before eating, and she said stroll with a slight tilt of her head, and then said, okay. They walked along the waterfront, and she looked out at the city lights and said the night breeze really does feel nice. It did. They stopped at a railing along the bridge, and she leaned against it and said she'd heard it was a popular date spot at night. She looked up at him and said she'd thought maybe he also wanted to do something like that. He stood there reading the sentence 3 ways at once, none of them landing comfortably. She was close and her hair was catching the light from the bridge, and he asked himself by that she means what exactly? His heart was doing everything at maximum volume, and he stood there thinking this couldn't actually be happening. There were supposed to be more steps before something like this. Proper progression, signs and signals that were clearer than this. He shut his eyes for just a moment. She looked up at him and asked, "Eh?" She said just kidding, and laughed brightly and asked if she'd surprised him. He stood there completely flushed and looked exactly like a man who had been surprised, and she said it was a joke and looked absolutely delighted. He had been had, thoroughly, yet again, by the exact same playbook. He was smiling even though he was embarrassed and he had no idea what to do with that. After they ate, walking under the city lights, he gathered everything he had and said that if she didn't mind, how about they watched movies at his place next time? She paused, smiled slowly, and raised the stakes immediately. How about all night at his place instead? He said his place was too cramped and she laughed and said foo foo foo. And they kept walking and he thought about the fact that she'd said next time. A few days later, his apartment was the cleanest it had ever been in its entire existence, for reasons he would not be naming. He lay flat on his back on the bed, staring at the ceiling with a strong sense of emptiness he couldn't explain, thinking about how it was just the usual weekend alone, but feeling heavier than usual. He was being honest with himself enough to admit that he'd cleaned this room for someone who hadn't said she was coming. He lay there anyway. He grabbed his phone and opened Twitter just to give his hands something to do. He scrolled through a completely ordinary timeline. Someone ate soba noodles, someone announced a release, someone got bomb luck in their fortune. He told himself to focus on something else and not think about Azusa-san. He thought about Azusa-san. Somewhere else entirely, a girl sat at her desk typing rapidly when her phone rang. She grabbed it and stared at the notification with eyes gone wide and spiral-shaped, completely overcome. She had gotten a reply from someone called Dark Knight Sensei, someone who had tagged her account and written sorry for the late reply. The caption in the corner confirmed it.